math and econ because I was just bored, I guess. Just kidding. There's a whole story behind that, but we don't have to get into that. Yeah, had a great time. Founded the 180 Degrees Consulting UC Irvine, which is sort of my first entryway into consulting. I was actually not sure if I wanted to go into banking or consulting. So my freshman year, I joined Smith, which is Student Managed Investment Fund. Not sure if it's still around, but joined that. And in my second year, I became president, and it was sort of this pivot moment where I talked to a lot of my banking friends, and I thought, not really for me. I want to do something more on the impact side of things. And that's when one of my friends, told me about 180. He was involved in his club at UPenn. So started a club, did a lot of work for nonprofits, a lot of good work, and just really got excited about the impact component of consulting and the ability to sort of, dive into a lot of different industries and use a lot of different types of frameworks and just like different parts of your mind over and over again. That was really cool. So that was sort of my first entryway into it. And then did an internship between the summer between my junior and senior year out here in New York. Loved the city, and made the call that I really wanted to be in the city as a full-time consultant. Applied through campus recruiting for Deloitte Consulting, and here I am 2 years later. Four industries, been in projects across 4 industries, 5 technology platforms. Started off on the ERP side, and then after the pandemic, since you can't really deploy any technology from home in your pajamas, I moved on to the strategy and analytics side of Deloitte, which has been super cool. That's a little bit about me, and that's how I got into consulting. Happy to dive into more details, and let's go from there.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for giving us that insight into your background and also like how you kind of got to where you are now. Could you tell us a little more about what you do in your current role at Deloitte and like what your day-to-day looks like?
Absolutely. So the day-to-day has changed a lot before the pandemic and after. I can sort of tell you before, it was get up at 4 a.m. on a Monday, catch the 5 a.m. flight, go to Chicago, at client site for 4 days, come back 1 a.m. on Thursday night or Friday morning, and then go to the office on Friday. So that was sort of my day-to-day before COVID. And then after that, it's hop on a Zoom call at 8 a.m. and wake up 5 minutes before your Zoom call and have your coffee. I don't know. But with respect to like the work itself, before the pandemic, it was different because you had your client sitting right next to you. So the feedback loop was a lot tighter as opposed to like after it's, hopping from Zoom call to Zoom call, it does push out some of the timelines that you might see in typical consulting projects, drag out for longer. For example, you might have researched, or some of you might have researched that strategy projects typically last between like 2 months to 4 months. But after the pandemic, due to these delays and feedback loops, they have like sort of moved out to a 6 to 8 month timeline. But with respect to what I'm doing right now, I've had 5 different roles since I joined the firm. So, was your typical sort of sprint agile methodology, sort of sprint captain, defect captain. After that, I was a machine learning consultant when I had the opportunity to like code for a asset management firm and sort of build some of their cloud-based strategies and deploy that in real time. And then moved on to be a product manager for a healthcare AI platform that Deloitte's built internally, and had the opportunity to sort of deploy that for one of our largest healthcare clients. That was super cool because basically what we're deploying was a way to see if patients who have diabetes can, show any signs of either getting worse or getting better. For example, like diabetes to ESRD or diabetes to like chronic kidney disease, or are they getting better, and sort of deploying those different features across different hospitals across the US. So that was super cool. That's like that. Those are like a couple of the roles that I've done. I guess in terms of day to day, I feel like one part that I love about consulting is that you never really know what your next day looks like until someone schedules a call on your calendar, and it might throw you off or just might take you on a different tangent. And you're expected to sort of pick up, you might be, let's say, assigned to like one work stream in a big project, right? Typically projects are like 200, 300 people large, but you might be assigned to, let's say, a team that's only 10 people large. And then, you're expected to still know what's going on with the other teams because you're expected to have that sort of cross collaboration all the time. So that's something that I was not used to when I was in college, even with a consulting club, and that's something you just have to get used to over time there.
Great, thank you so much. It's definitely great to hear kind of how everything adjusted. I know for everyone, definitely as undergraduate students, how we've been having to adjust with the Zoom and like having to do that as well within regards to professional life as well. So it's definitely great to hear kind of how your professional experience has adjusted in terms of the pandemic, but also like what you do in terms of your day to day. So thank you for that. So just for the next question, the question is, what was your toughest aspect of the job and what's your favorite part at Deloitte?
Yeah. Um, long hours and not being able to maintain a healthy healthy lifestyle balance, I would say, not work-life balance. But that's been better after the pandemic. So before, since you're always traveling, you don't really necessarily get to cook. And I'm an avid, I guess chef. I love to cook different things, but um, you're at the mercy of whatever takeout options you have in your client side or your office or something like that, Monday through Thursday, which is good and a bad thing. Some people love it. Some people just want to consume outside food 24/7. Some people want to sort of balance it off with a healthier diet. So it was difficult when you're in client side. It's a lot better when you're working from home. But the hours can also get long, and it's not a joke. I mean, if you just pull up Glassdoor and you see consulting hours, or you just pull up any consulting meme page on Instagram, like those memes are based on reality. So hours could be bad, but the difference here is it's not going to be every day. So you're probably going to have like a couple of weeks, or let's say a month at the most, where your hours are bad, and then it would sort of even out as you go in a project. Because when you're trying to deploy a technology and it's going live, let's say next week, then I'll probably be working and upwards of 50, 55, 60 if we're not doing any go lives, or it's just a functional design part of things, or just like more on the strategy part of things, then it's going to be easier hours. So that gets a little bit, it takes a little bit of time to get adjusted to it. In terms of what's my favorite part, hands down, I would have to talk about my first project at Deloitte, which was, actually deploying sort of, the overall thing was the client had like 500 different legacy systems, and they kept like acquiring companies without really understanding that, hey, we have something called technology in the background, and you kind of have to like make those tech platforms talk to each other. It can't work this way. And our job was to sort of take those 500 different platforms and put it into 5. By the end of the day, since the client was in waste management and doesn't sound sexy, but it was waste management industrials client, but I got the opportunity to sit with like truck drivers and actually see the technology deploy. So sitting with them in Houston, Texas, as a byproduct of the project, I learned about the drug cartels in Texas, which was not part of the scope. I swear to God, this is not any consulting project, but it was fun, right? Just sitting with them, seeing the technology firsthand and having that sort of binary perspective of, okay, whether this works or it does not work. And if it does not work, fixing that in real time was super cool. It was more like drinking from a fire hose, I would say. Yeah, that's hands down been like my most favorite memory. Longest hours I've ever put in any sort of month, hands down, but a lot of learning as well.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree. I've been told like with consulting, like the work-life balance is always really tough because you're always working super long hours. And so yeah, it's definitely good to hear that like it's somewhat manageable for you, but unfortunately for like the life-work balance, sorry about sorry about that.
It depends on the client is what I want to also tell you. Like if you work for federal clients, well, shut office at 5 p.m. and they're out of there. I'll probably hang out with Joe Biden or something. So you're lucky if you get federal clients. If you get banking clients, they never sleep. So good luck. But it really depends on which client you get.
Of course. So thank you so much for that insightful advice. And it was great hearing about your very first project. I know there's always like kind of that more passion that you have in terms of like, it's your first opportunity and your first project. So it's definitely great to hear how you get that kind of that one-on-one experience and like hands-on experience for that. And so, yeah, just going on to kind of like a more question that students would be kind of able to be more able to, be more relatable to. So as you are the current, for prospective students, what qualities and skills do you think are the most important that consulting firms such as Deloitte or many kind of other consulting firms will look for? And do you have any tips for students who are looking to break into the consulting industry?
Yeah, I think it boils down to just two very, very simple qualities, and they're typically the most overlooked in any sort of recruiting process. And even when I was recruiting, I never thought about them in detail. or you may have heard of these buzzwords, but you never really understand what they really mean. So number one would be coachability or adaptability. So what that really means in practice is if I throw a different kind of problem at you, how do you react to it? Do you react saying, okay, I don't know anything about this industry or anything about this problem. I'm very excited to learn and let's go. Or do you be more on the nervous side of things, or you take too long to acclimate yourself and you're not really receptive to sort of new ideas, right? So that's sort of the first point of bifurcation. You really have to be on the former side of things, where I'm not trying to preach that you have to have like sort of the go mentality, but you have to be aware enough to be able to catch new learnings, new findings, and just shifting priorities all the time and then adapt to it. The second part is very simple. It's communication and networking. I just got promoted in the firm last week, and 90% of your promotion decisions are stemming from how strong your network is and what kind of relationships you built with clients. So what they really look for is, did this person get a distinguished client service award or not? You might have different awards depending on like the firm that you join, but you get rated. I mean, your metrics are only 10%. So you can put in as many hours as you want. You can get the best reviews as you want, but that's only going to be 10% of the equation for your promotion decision. So just like moving up in the consulting world, 90% of it is going to be your relationship building. And how do you build that in college? Well, you can't really do that. It's more like trial by fire. But like one way to do that is by joining clubs, right? So maybe like UVA or SCNO or 180 or something like that, right? It just like expose yourselves to client environments while you're in college. It could be through a consulting club or through any other club. Even like if you're volunteering and you're talking to somebody from the nonprofit, like C-suite or their volunteer manager or something like that, that counts as well, right? And you just expose yourself to an environment where you don't really have all the data and you're trying to figure it out, and how do you communicate that? Do you hold your ground or do you sort of shake and ramble on, right? So those two things are key. And then how to break into consulting. The beauty is they really aren't looking for specific majors. So that could be a good or a bad thing. If you're historically from a major that is more competitive for consulting, for example, biz admin, BIM, like a lot of students want to break into consulting as opposed to like someone from philosophy, I guess. But the more diverse set of experiences you can show, the better your chances are to break into consulting. I can give you an example. For example, my deployment project in my squad that we had in Texas, we had 6 folks. One was a nuclear engineer for USS some submarine in Antarctica for 10 years, and then he joined consulting. Another one was a doctor who served 5 tours in Iraq from 2005 to 2015 or something like that. Another one was a professor at a university somewhere teaching sociology. Another one was like from, I think, a math and science background. I had a couple of internships in NASA and SpaceX. So the point I'm trying to make here is just like, there's no one set sort of formula to get into consulting, but like, if you can show that you have exposed yourselves to very unique environments, I mean, as unique as someone from Teach from America can get into McKinsey because they have a pipeline, because that's like super, super exciting, right? Like you're teaching kids and how do you deal with them? How do you have that patience, right? Those are the skills they're looking for. And so therefore, like teachers also make a good case for consultants. But point here is a lot of different backgrounds. Do not waste your summers trying to sort of do the same equation that you think everybody else is trying to put. The weirder your internship, the better your chances to get into consulting. And I know I'm probably like in the minority of folks who are going to say this to you, but I swear to God, if I like see 50 biz admin profiles, I was in the UCI recruiting panel for this spring and fall. There are a lot of biz admin folks, let's be honest, who are trying to apply to like Deloitte. And if I see like 50 biz admin folks, all of them doing the same thing, then I don't really know how to differentiate. I mean, one guy would play like golf and another person would play like, I don't know, softball. Like, how do you like differentiate that? You can't, right? So the more unique your background, the better it is. Sorry, I rambled on a little bit, but that was the key takeaway.
No, I definitely think that rambling was very insightful, and I definitely learned a lot. Thanks for emphasizing again how important exposure is and also differentiating yourself. I think sometimes we can get so caught up in learning material that we often forget that detail as well. So that was definitely a great point you brought up. I was just wondering, as someone who graduated from undergrad not too long ago, can you tell us about how the transition into full-time consulting work was?
Transition into full-time consulting work. Okay. So the good news is every consulting firm will put you through training, right? You're not gonna go join a consulting firm and be at client side or be in front of a client day one. Typically, you'll have like your start class, your onboarding peers, your mentors assigned to you within the firm. There will be a ton of resources that will be thrown at you, and then it's sort of up to you how many of them you want to pick up, how many of them you want to utilize, which ones you think are more relevant for a situation as opposed to, you know, which ones are not, because you're going to get like 100 options. You have to pick like 5. So the first couple of months, typically you'll spend in training. So it's going to be an easier transition. And then it depends. So this is where like your background in consulting comes into play, or background in client service, honestly, like not just like consulting clubs, just like any client service. If you've had client service exposure in the past and you know how to deal with like professionals in the workplace because you've done a couple of internships or something like that, your learning curve is going to be a lot flatter than someone coming in from, let's say, a highly technical background, has never done client service, and has only like coded for 4 years in college, right? So it really depends there. So that's why I'm asking you to like expose yourselves to like as many client facing scenarios as possible in college in a variety of ways. Like even going to office hours, I would consider that as a client service scenario, because you have to like maintain a good reputation with your professors and not say something absurd. But yeah, so in 2 months, you'll get acclimated to the technical sides that you might need in consulting. So you will be equipped with all the functional knowledge that you need about a given enterprise system, or if you're in strategy, you will get all the different frameworks that you could be using, and then all the different industry booklets and guidance and all that. And then all the client facing resources, like, you know, presentation decks and all that good stuff. And then it's up to you. How do you start getting involved? How much of, you know, the work you try to take? One piece of advice I have for any like future consultants is, if you're doing well, they're going to keep giving you more work. So it's just the nature of consulting, because if you're doing well, that means you're building a good reputation for yourself, which means other people also want you, which means they're going to fight for your time. So then after a year into consulting, it becomes super important for you to set your boundaries, because if you don't, you're going to be working Saturday at like 9 p.m. for a manager that you don't even know, and you don't even remember how you signed up for this, but you're working. So to avoid that, I would definitely encourage you to like start doing some expectation setting right from the get-go. Like at the get-go, I mean like a couple of weeks into the project, so that you don't burn out. And burnout is real. I always thought burnout is like a lie and a scam, and like, you know, watching a lot of Gary Vee or someone on YouTube does not help at all when you're in college, because you get over enthusiastic for everything. And then, you know, I triple majored, never faced burnout, and then I joined consulting, and in 3 months I was dead, because I was involved in too many things, too many firm initiatives. Just like how you have clubs in campus, you have firm initiatives, and then project work and all that. And I was like, something's wrong. I can't do with this. Like, why am I working on a Saturday evening and a Sunday evening? This makes no sense. So you got to set your boundaries pretty fast. That's something nobody teaches you in college, but that's something you have to pay extra attention to, if that makes sense.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much for that, Raj. I definitely agree that like burnout is definitely something that is underlooked in terms of very kind of like at UC Irvine too. And then once it hits you, it's just, oh my God, like it's not a hoax.
It's not fake.
I haven't lost hair yet, thankfully, but yeah, thank you for that. But yeah, we did kind of want to open up to the open Q&A portion, since we do want to value your time and have ample time for your presentation and the case study. So yeah, we just wanted to open up to the audience. If you have any questions before Raj does do his presentations, feel free to unmute, or please put it down in the chat below.
Or you can unmute yourself and talk, and we don't bite, I hope.
Yeah, or preferably unmute. That'd be great too.
Hi Raj. I just want to say thank you for like all the insight you provided. Like the last like 30 minutes is like pretty like cool hearing like your experience, just like coming like recent graduate as well. I guess like one specific question I had was like, how has your experience been like working at like the New York office? Like if it's different from like being at like different like office firms and stuff too.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever you join a consulting firm, know that your office location matters probably the most, after sort of your service vertical within the firm. By service vertical, I just mean like your industry preference. The reason I'm saying that is because every office is a conglomerate of power, right? So you have a concentration of power. And by power, I mean the kind of partners that are associated with that office, the kind of like leadership that sit or operate out of that office. Less relevant now in COVID times, but by the time, I mean, some of you get into consulting, things might go back to in person. Sorry, did I lose connection? Sorry, I never. Oh, yeah, so things might go back in person, and you typically want to focus on your office preference with respect to two things. Number one, what type of projects you would like to do. For me, I wanted to be with investment management professionals, healthcare firms, more on consumer products side. CPG has been sort of my family business background, so I wanted to work for CPG. And I wanted the New York thrill, if you may, because I did my internship here and it was just a fun experience. So that's why I pushed really hard for the New York office and I'm here. Some people would love to work for our TMT clients, right? So tech, media, and telecommunications. Think of like your Google, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, all those clients. For those folks who want to go into sort of more tech-focused projects, San Francisco office makes sense for you. For folks who want to go into like oil and gas or industrials, you're looking at Chicago, Texas. If you're looking for, let's say, your Disney's and Hulu's and Netflix and those kind of clients, you're looking at the LA office or Atlanta office. So it really depends. Office really depends what kind of projects you can get. I mean, not completely true. This is only about 80% true. You can always network with partners from a different location and get on a project that way. That's kind of what I did for most of my projects. But it's an easier starting point. You're just saving yourself 4 hours because the partner's sitting right there. You can walk up to his or her office and make an introduction. So that's number one. And number two is definitely like where the power scale is, right? So for example, for Deloitte in California, you might want to be associated with the Costa Mesa office or the Bay Area office. And then on the East Coast, you want to be associated with the Chicago and the New York offices because they're larger offices. The larger the office, the larger your start class, which means more friends right from the get-go. So that's also something you might want to consider. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Awesome. And we also have a question in the chat from Naveen. He said, "Hi, Raj. Thank you so much for coming. What's one skill that you feel carried over from college to your current role, or one lesson that was really useful for you?"
Good question. So I would say presenting and communicating your ideas in a very succinct fashion. I learned that through like two key experiences. Number one would be obviously 180 and the consulting projects and sort of serving clients in the community. Number two, the UCI, what's it called? The startup competition, whatever it's called, entrepreneur, what is it called? Beal's the engineering one, whatever, the business school one. So the startup competition that happens in the business school every year, participated in that 3 years in a row. My team at won in the last year. So super helpful there because we were, constantly giving elevator speeches, right? And throwing ideas and trying to like refine our pitch. New venture competition. Thank you, Edward. So yeah, NVC, and, learned a lot through one of the folks who actually started the NVC program back in the day. His name is David Ochi. If you have a chance to talk to him, highly recommend, refining your pitch and just being super like crisp and clear to the point under like 45 seconds or lower or less, I guess. That's the key skill in consulting because you're gonna have to present every hour by the hour to some client counterpart, and you have to be ready with your ideas and you have to be ready to communicate, let's say 7 different updates in 30 seconds or less. And if you take too much of their time, they've already lost your attention and you're kicked out of the room. So not virtually, but like you get the point. That's number one skill. Hopefully that helps.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Raj. Thank you for everyone who did ask questions. We did want to give time for Raj to do his presentation. So I did make you co-host if you want to, feel free to just present away.
Absolutely. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we do.
Awesome. So I hope folks have seen the video I asked to share. If not, that's totally fine. I'm happy to sort of go over this right now and just try to, give you the overview of the case study or the case interview per se, and sort of how it fits into the bigger picture. This slide deck that I'm presenting today is slightly outdated, so I'll definitely give you sort of my updated view on what this looks like as we go through the slides, and then we'll have a case, let's say 30 minutes of real casing where we can brainstorm together and do all that fun stuff. So yeah, with that, the case interview, I guess we could start with the consulting interview in general. The traditional consulting interview goes anywhere from 30 minutes to 45 minutes, with the first about 10 to 20 minutes reserved for behavior questions. So getting to know you more, getting to know your background, getting to know your consulting background, or just like background in client service and communication. And then after that, you dive into this component called the case interview. And case interview really tries to test, in my opinion, it tries to test two things. Number one, can you think quickly on your feet? And number two, can you sort of seemingly connect random dots or random pieces of information that we're going to throw your way and try to form a cohesive story using those sort of brief pieces of information. I think really case study or case interview really boils down to that. So before we get there, this is typically like the structure that you're seeing on your screen right now. The way they conduct this might be different depending on the company you're interviewing with. Some companies have a very informal approach to cases. For example, that's very interviewee-led cases. So you're the one who has to sort of push questions and agendas and all that and try to like drive the conversation. And on the flip side, there might be like an interviewer-led case. So McKinsey Deloitte does like the interviewer-led case. So we ask you all the questions and then you sort of give us the answers, if that makes sense. We just done the why case study and why companies do the case study. I think like this in general, what you're seeing on the screen is great. But in my opinion, case studies do have their own flaws. It's not a perfect way of evaluating a candidate's fit for consulting, which is why typically consulting firms have multiple case interview rounds. It can be anywhere from 2 to 7. I personally have given 7 interview rounds before and like 4 in one day, and it was not pretty. It's a test of attrition, right? Like it's just trying to test how much stamina you have and like how long can you sort of use your brain without faltering, right? And the reason for that is they're trying to simulate a client situation where you're going to be in front of a client, working all day, presenting ideas and bouncing off of, your own teammates' ideas in a very like fast-paced environment. So that's what they're trying to like mimic for the most part. What they use in the case, well, typically your cases, I'm just going to skip to the next slide, will have like 3 components. So there's obviously going to be like, the problem statement that's going to be given to you. And then, after the problem statement, you'll be expected to sort of come up with a framework. Now, a lot of people use a lot of different frameworks. There are whole books on this. You have like Case in Point and McKinsey Mind and all those books. I think like hot take, every single one of them is useless. The reason I say that is because most of the frameworks that you see in those books are outdated and none of them will fit the case you're about to take in 2021 or beyond. Now you'll tell me, okay, that's great. Why are their books like still selling? The reason is they give you like a good starting point. So, there are a lot. So for example, these frameworks that I'm going to put on the screen right now, like for example, a profit tree like framework. This is like very basic, right? I mean, anyone can tell me, like any business major can tell me what profits are, right? It's revenue minus cost, right? You don't need a book to tell you that. Or for example, like the 3 C's, right? So you're maybe like a marketing framework that you might have, right? So your customers, competition, and competitors, I guess. And then another one could be like your SWOT analysis, right? So like this is something you did in like high school, probably like your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, right? So the reason I'm telling you these frameworks are outdated is because most of the cases are going to be a simulated version of what really happened in a client environment, right? So all the cases that we have here at Deloitte and all the ones that I've seen so far in my interviews with other consulting firms, they've always been, a real client environment that typically that manager or partner that's interviewing you has gone through himself or herself in like real life, and they, redacted like the client name and the real actual information, and they're presenting you that case. So it's like very personal to them, which is why if you try to force fit a very generic framework to answer any case interview, you may not do well. The way you get better at this is you start reading industry trends and you try to apply a generic framework first, or just generic thought process, right? For example, if I tell you
So
like,
don't say too much about it.
Uh-huh.
sorry,
Who's
Someone's unmuted.
yeah, apologies if I'm boring y'all. But yeah, so the way I would think about it is two things. Number one, start reading like newsletters or something that give you like a general idea of industry trends. The ones I recommend are Morning Brew, specifically their emerging tech ones and the regular ones that they send out. And the second one will be the Daily Upside, which is more like finance focused. That's how you start getting into the trends, you know, the day-to-day trends of what's happening in the economy. So that's number one. And then number two is just using your common sense. It's highly underrated. Nobody tells you this for consulting companies, but at the end of the day, what we're testing is, can you really like put basic thoughts together, right? It's just like sometimes you have to just connect the dots because the answer is right there in front of you. You just have to like connect a piece of information that was given to you at the beginning of the case and connect it at the end of the case. That's like a lot of the battle sometimes. But yeah, so typically 3 components, right? You have your strategy, operations, marketizing. Marketizing is just like estimating. It's more on the math side of things, the quantitative side of things. We won't get into that today, but it's like estimating something for a market. For example, like, I don't know why I'm seeing this, but okay. So for example, you could say, let's estimate the number of people who wear a suit in New York City on a daily basis, right? And how would you approach that? So the beauty of case interview is there is no right answer whatsoever. It's whatever answer you can get to, but how the important part is, how do you back up your answer? Or like what metrics or what pieces of information or what logic are you using to sort of construct that answer and then back it up with whatever information that's been thrown at you. That's like the key takeaway from like case interviews, and that's the only thing you have to really get good at. I mean, you can watch a gazillion YouTube like videos on the different aspects of casing, and you can be good at one thing versus another. It just boils down to this, right? Like, and the way you get really smart with your common sense and putting industry trends together is by reading up on it. Like, and that's sort of what I do before I try to interview, and that's what I did in the past as well. Instead of like casing a lot, I just started reading a lot, and it just helped. Yeah, this is like the generic, like how to approach your case. There are different parts of a case. I don't know if this, okay, so this does not address that. Okay, so typically here's like the general like end-to-end frame, like end-to-end process of a case interview. You get a question, then you get a couple of minutes for any clarification questions that you may have. So that's just like, understanding the company in more detail. Then you get a couple of minutes to sort of draw up your initial framework or initial thought process, basically, or list of points that you want to address. Then they dive into like more specific questions about the case. Maybe like they're trying to hone in on, let's say, the profits versus just like the revenue, for example, or the cost instead of the revenue. And at the end, you're expected to like summarize the case and summarize your findings and all that good stuff. So that's like the general end to end of a case interview. And hopefully the YouTube, and if none of this makes sense and I'm going too fast, just go watch the YouTube video that you might have received. That will definitely explain this in like more detail. Here's a trick that I want to give you for how to open your case and then how to end your case, because I think that's really important. And then I did not read that in any book. This was taught to me by a partner at Bain. So number one, the way you open with clarification questions, you always ask clarification questions across these 4 buckets. Bucket number 1, ask about the company itself, right? So if you've been given a company, let's say Google, ask about the Google products that are relevant to the case, ask about their current revenues or past trends, ask about if they recently had a CEO change or not, so leadership changes and anything that like that happened. Ask about, their, let's say, marketing, or if any division is doing particularly worse, something like that. Second bucket would just be your competitors and industry, right? So depending on where the case is trying to push you, for example, if it's a finance case, you have to ask, okay, are we talking about, just after 2008? Are we talking about 2018? What's the timeline? What year are we talking about? Where are our competitors going? So, if it's, let's say, coming back to the Google case, is Facebook doing better than us in some regards? If so, why? Or if we have a pending lawsuit against Apple, how is that affecting us, for example, right? So talking about your competitors. Bucket number 3 that you want to ask questions about are very important are about budget and timeline. So how much budget do we have for this project? Sometimes you don't get a number per se, but you might get, okay, we have the flexibility to do this project for, let's say, 12 months, right? So budget and timeline go hand in hand. Either they'll give you like a dollar value, or they'll tell you this is like the max number of months we can serve the client for. And the 4th bucket are key risks that you need to identify. For example, are they going to go through any like mergers in the future or acquisitions in the future? Has there been like a recent technology change on the inside, right? So a backend technology change can affect a lot of things. Has there been like any great HR changes, maybe? Like, so talent model, org restructuring, change management, all that good stuff. For example, like, if you had like 10 people on their board of directors and they expanded that to 20, that might affect it, because, that might affect how you get your buy-in at the final presentation day when you're trying to present all the ideas to the client and they have to like really sell you on your work. So those are the 4 buckets. I'll repeat myself just for those who are taking notes, I guess. So about the company itself, product offerings, revenue trends. Number 2, competitors. Number 3, budget and timeline. And number 4, key risks associated with the project. That's sort of how you open a case. And how you close a case. I don't think anybody cares about what aspect of the case you're trying to summarize, or which, whatever your final key takeaways would be. I think as long as you can keep it under 45 seconds, I think that's key. Do not ever take more than 45 seconds to close a case. And what I mean to close a case, to summarize sort of your final recommendations. Why? Because they are, at that part of the case, they're really testing like, how will this person behave if I put him in front of the CEO tomorrow? That's what they're testing. And if anybody tells you otherwise, they're lying to your face. So like, whenever you're trying to close a case, do not take more than 45 seconds. That's like my top recommendation. I'm going to pause here for questions. I can't see the chat, but I know it's popping. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to pause here and sort of take any questions before I go into the case. Okay, someone raised their hand, so happy to.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, when is a point where it's like, because you did mention asking clarifying questions, but I feel like there's a point where it's a little too much and it's as if like you don't know what's going on, and I don't want to come off that way. So where do you think there's like a line being
Yeah,
drawn?
so sometimes the interviewer will give you cues to tell you basically they're asking too much. The cues are, this is something you should evaluate as part of the case. That's a sign that don't ask for the questions for this bucket they're trying to ask. This will be a part of the case, right? Second cue they might give you is not relevant to the case, right? That's when you know that maybe like what you're trying to go into is not going to be super helpful for the next 30 minutes. Third sign they might give you is, okay, we have some data, but we don't really know a lot. So they'll give you like a couple of statistics about what you're asking, but they don't dive too much into it. That's also a sign that, okay, I'm getting this data, but probably it's not going to be super useful, maybe until the end or until like a later point when we get like an updated information about a case, about some part of the case, right? Hopefully that helps. And then if they, about the last point, the data point, half of the data that you'll be presented in the case is going to be useless. I'm just going to give it to you. Like, I'm just going to tell you that. The reason for that is they're also trying to understand, can you distinguish the real value-added information from the noise, right? And what I mean by that is, can you understand from my original question that the client had, which pieces of information that I'm giving you are going to be relevant and which ones are going to be a complete waste of my time? That's also something they're trying to like understand. How do you get better at that? There's no class you can take. There's no like business school 101 on how to get better at understanding what's noise and what's not noise, right? But you just, when you start reading these industry trends, you can see some, let's say, highlights or, key ratios or key decisions that get reported in the news, right? They see over and over again. And that's when you try to understand, okay, this might be relevant. For example, I don't know how many of you keep in touch with like emerging technology. So Neuro.ai is like a robotic autonomous driving startup. They recently had a collaboration with Domino's where they sort of served your pizza in their sort of R2, which is their sort of self-driving vehicle. and it serves right to your doorstep. Now, if you look at that example, so I'm going too specific, but stop me if you want to. But if you look at that example, typically, like, if I give you a case on that, if I tell you, okay, you want to make an investment in Euro, how do you figure out if it's a good investment or not? Well, what do you look at? You're going to look at how many successful deliveries it had with Domino's, right? What was their cost per delivery? What was their revenue per delivery, right? How much did they invest up front in the technology? So how much of research and development was needed to get to that stage? And then what's their forecast on how much money they'll need to sort of enhance that technology in the next few years, right? Those might be like your first top line metrics. Then in your second level, or like deeper, let's say you're in the middle of the case, I might give you metrics on operations, right? So I can say, for example, oh, it was great. They had, let's say they drove about 1,500 miles in total across all their customers, but R2 broke down 17% of the times in these 4 routes, right? So you might want to go and look into those routes and see, okay, is it affecting like a certain zip code of the customer? Is it affecting is it a Domino's problem, or is it a customer problem, right? Or is it like a pizza order problem? So let's say somebody ordered like 55 pepperoni large pizzas and you can't fit that in one R2. Well, that doesn't sound like a Domino's problem or a customer problem, right? So how do you figure that out, if that makes sense? So like those are the key, I'm sorry, I'm probably going off tangent, but like those are the cues that you can get over and over again in the case to sort of figure out if you're going in the right direction or wrong direction.
No,
And
that was great. Thank you so much.
it will come to you. It will like instinctively come to you. If something's wrong, it will come to you. Any other questions? Sorry. Cool. Awesome. So we can go into a case real quick. If you can remove me from Spotlight, I'd love to look at like everybody and see who's raising hands and, facilitate a brainstorming as to the best of my abilities. So I would encourage all of you to go into like gallery view so you can like see each other. If you want to go on video, that'll be great. I'd love to see your faces. And let's just take like a piece of, pen and paper or pencil, whatever. And, I'll sort of walk you through a case. We can start with, I'll sort of give you like all the cues as and when needed, and I'll provide feedback in my commentary at the end. So if that makes sense, happy to start there, and let's give everybody like a couple of minutes to get ready, and we'll get started. All right, is everyone ready? Cool. So feel free to go off of mute, because I would love for this to be sort of brainstorming, live discussion. Would love to hear your voices, and otherwise it's just going to be awkward silence, and nobody likes that in a case interview. So let's start with the prompt. I'll give you the prompt, and I'll give us, let's say, about 5 minutes to think about the clarification questions, and another 5 to 10 minutes to come up with the framework. All of you can sort of brainstorm live. Or if you want to keep, like, if a lot of people are trying to answer at the same time, feel free to raise your hand and we sort of jot down our points together and then go from there, if that sounds good. And it's going to be like super simple, so no need to like overthink any of this. It's just use your common sense. So with that, I'll give you the case. So this is the prompt. Your client is Roscoe and Company, which is a beer company in an African country. They just hired a new managing director whose first task was to visit various bars to better understand the market. He hears that some bars don't sell Roscoe beer because they can't get the product. Why are these bars unable to acquire the product?
Is there a way you can share screen, please? Or like, can we get that in a text form?
So typically when you do a case interview, you will not see a shared screen. You'll just see the interviewer's face. So you'll have to like,
gotcha.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time for the prompt one more time, Raj?
Yeah, absolutely. So your client is Roscoe and Company, which is a beer company in an African country. They have just hired a new managing director, so say like CEO, whose first task was to visit various bars to better understand the market. He hears that some bars don't sell Roscoe beer because they can't get the product. Why are these bars unable to acquire the product? And yes, the client name is really Roscoe, R-A-S-C-A-L beer. All right, so initial thoughts, clarification questions, let's go. Feel free to unmute and start asking questions.
Is there like a certain license that you need to like get these?
Every bar has a license already, and so does Roscoe Beer.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, how are the deliveries being made?
Right, that's good. So the distribution market is definitely fragmented, right? There are approximately, let's say, 1,000 local distributors, but each bar can only have one distributor associated with it. And the product is, it's placed fairly well with the distributors. We tap into approximately 250 out of the 1,000 local distributors.
What area did you visit the bars in? Like which country or which cities?
It's like pretend any African country, if that makes sense. And it's a national brand, so across that country.
Do you know like the population of the bars that were visited?
Not really relevant in this case.
I just had one quick question. How difficult will it be to gain access, and how many suppliers and who supplies them?
I don't really understand your question.
Oh, okay, so it's not relevant to the question. Sorry about that. I was just wondering who the suppliers were for it, or were the suppliers themselves?
Yeah, you could just like for like, case purposes, you can imagine every single distributor is the same. We
Right.
supply beer, but we don't
Okay.
to the bar. We have a supply chain process in place, which eventually, gets our product to the bars through distributors.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I misunderstood. Thank you.
No worries.
Right. So how many bars are there and how many of them are not getting the beers?
That's a very good question. That's something you might want to consider for the case.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you have any like specific comments from those bars, like any interviews that you did with them?
Absolutely. So the key pain point that was highlighted was the infrastructure seems to be a problem, and the deliveries are breaking down at some point in the supply chain. You have to go figure out which point.
Is there a cost? Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, sorry. What are the logistics from delivering the beer from the supplier?
So the brewery goes to the distributors, goes to the bars, goes to the clients or consumers.
Is there any cost related factors that's inhibiting these bars from acquiring it from certain distributors, or is it?
No, they're all so the margins for different beers along each step of the value chain are pretty comparable.
All right, thank you.
So Raj, you mentioned we're working with a number of distributors. I was wondering if we can look at any of the data associated with them, like completion rate, geographical market area of these distributors, so we can maybe try to optimize there.
Definitely, that's something we'll address as part of the case. Any other clarifying questions before we move on to the framework? Awesome. Okay, so let's brainstorm our framework together. So you have all the data that was just presented to you. How would you approach this in terms of a framework that makes sense? So just how, like, what are the different categories you would like to dive into? Let's brainstorm together, come up with one framework, and then we'll go from there. Any high level thoughts? Anyone? Don't be shy. We don't bite.
I'm gonna help. I'll ask this, but just one last thought is I view it as if we're trying to increase the number of beers distributed, it's number of distributors times the number of bars those distributors can reach times the number of beers that each bar will purchase. So maybe breaking it down into those metrics and see what drives each of those. But Raj, thank you so much. A true inspiration for the Solon community. So gotta take off now.
Absolutely. Thanks, Edward. Take care. So that was one framework. That was a very metrics driven one where we can assign sort of values to it and go from that. I feel like that might be like one step below the main sort of high level points that we're trying to accomplish. What's like the first basic common sense points that everybody can sort of think about when you think about like a distribution channel or just like a supply chain channel? Does that make sense?
Is it the deliveries? Sorry.
Go for it. Yeah.
Is it the deliveries made by the distributors?
Sure. So distributors to bars. So the delivery could be one aspect. Cool. What else?
Production rate and what country the factories are in.
Production rate. Okay. So production rate of the brewery itself. That's great. So that's another bucket. Great. And somebody should write these things down so we can sort of consolidate at the end.
Possibly the margins and the cost for the beer itself as well.
Okay, sure. So that will also be associated with the brewery, right? Because the beer is produced there. Okay, cool. We can put it down in the brewery bucket. Along with
how many beers each distributors sort of received on the supply chain end?
Absolutely. So we can put down in the distributor bucket, along with the delivery part that Billy Patrick mentioned. So we have brewery, distributors. What else is missing? Do people consume beer at the distributor level?
No, the bars.
Bars itself.
Bars. Great. What do you want to think about when you think about the bars themselves?
How much they sell from the beer in Roscoe?
Absolutely. Okay. So their own profit margins. Great. What else?
And like how many beers are reaching the pubs?
Absolutely. Delivery side, right. And there maybe like their capacity, how many they can hold, right, in the first place. Right, that's bars. Cool. And the beer drinks itself, or the beer is consumed by someone?
Consumed by someone.
So consumers, right? Cool. What do you want to think about that?
Could it be like the popularity of like the beer brand itself compared to competitors?
Absolutely. Yep. Popularity, preferences. People like, different people like different beers, so might want to consider that. Cool. So it looks like we have our 4 buckets. The breweries, distributors, bars, consumers. Anything else we're missing, or do you think this is solid?
Maybe this has already been addressed, but maybe like how many individuals in the market and how much of like the market that our sort of brand is capturing, and then you can break it down. You can use that sort of metric to like work your way through market sizing and break down like specific numbers, unless that's already provided.
Absolutely, yeah. So getting an understanding of their market share with respect to like consumer preferences, I like that for sure. I think you could put that under brewery itself, right?
Could another like information be like the timeline of how long they've been like distributing to?
I'm not really sure I get your point, but would you like to rephrase?
I mean, like if they've been like a newer company distributing like in that geographical area, or if that makes sense.
National brand,
Okay.
right? Our client is already a national brand.
Mhm.
We don't really foresee any problems in terms of just like getting new distributors on board, since there are only about 1,000 of them across the country. I think the problem here might be like, since we only tap into 250 of them, what's happening with the other 750, right? Cool, cool, cool. Come on, guys, brainstorming. Don't be all on mute. This is awkward. You know how awkward this is? Come on, let's talk.
Wait, so when you like mentioned how like there's like 250 out of like the 1,000, right, local distributors, so could there be like some sort of like disagreement or conflict between like the distributions?
Absolutely. Where does that conflict go? Distributor bucket or bar bucket?
I think distributor.
Absolutely. Yep, there might be conflicts. There will also might be conflicts at the bars, right? Because imagine your typical bar. If you haven't been to one, I'm sorry, you'll get there eventually. But you know, you only have so much shelf space, so you can't show all the beers at the same time, right? So that means the bars are also actively making a choice on which ones to show and which ones not to show. What else? We have, so let's recap what we have so far, right? We have our sort of 4 categories that we're trying to understand this question from. We have the brewery lens, we have the distributor lens, we have the bars themselves, and we have the consumers. Anything that's not been addressed, any other things you would like to dig further into, given the chance, given the time, data, anything, like, what are we missing?
Do we know how long it takes to distribute the beers to the different distributors?
Absolutely. Time, yeah, average time to delivery. So that would be a distributor problem for sure, or a brewery and distributor problem combined. Good metric, very good metric. What else? I'm gonna start calling out people because y'all are too quiet.
Distributors' capacity, can they even distribute anymore?
Absolutely. Capacity of distribution and also capacity of the bars themselves to hold the product, right? Because everybody will have limited storage. So excellent point, Nikesh. Cool, awesome. Okay, so we have a framework. We can start digging, one level down into the details. We won't go too much into the quantitative side of things. We'll try to keep it more on the, just thinking and common sense side of things. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with brewery, right? What are the different things you might want to look at that might be causing a problem for our client at the brewery level? I can't say that properly. Yeah. At their manufacturing plant level, let's just say that.
Like possibly like mismanagement or
Absolutely. Production mismanagement.
production rate.
100%. You should start writing those points down. What else? Somebody mentioned time to delivery, right? So we actually have metrics on that. Transportation to distributors takes between anywhere between 2 days and 2 weeks. And their internal planning process is not aligned with the demand forecast that the distributors are trying to give them. So now with this updated information, where do you think the bottleneck is?
I think it's between like the manufacturers and the distributors. Since it's like 2 days to 2 weeks, that's like a pretty like big gap. So there must be like some issues of why it takes so long sometimes.
Absolutely. That's a fair point. So let's write that down as one of our key takeaways that we have recognized to the data. That'll be helpful in summarizing the case at the end, right? And this is sort of the exercise you should be doing while you're doing the case, right? Anytime you see a key piece of information and you just thought about something that might be affecting one of these, key buckets that you thought about, write that point down and, highlight it, market something, because that's going to be useful to you at the very end when you're trying to summarize your case and make that elevator speech in 45 seconds or less. Cool. So I think we've exhausted brewery. Let's go to distributors. What are the factors that we mentioned for distributors, and what would we like to dig deeper?
Like cost, how long they're delivering to the bars, and then their capacity as well.
Absolutely. So one of the problems that we discovered was they're favoring to promote some beers and not others. Okay. And since, the margins for all beers are the same, beer selection is now only driven by consumer preference, not by price. So with this updated information, what are we thinking about distributors? And where do you think the problem lies now?
Is there a way to get an idea of what the reach of the specific distributors are? So for example, if one distributor has a little more impact for like the bars that are in the area in comparison to like certain distributor only limiting themselves to a certain amount.
That would be great further point to dive into more on the quantitative side of the case, but for the purpose of this case, just assume that one bar can only be associated with one distributor, if that makes sense. So their reach is limited, but everyone has a great reach when it comes to their own local areas, because the distributors only operate at the local level, not at the state or national level. They're highly local, all 1,000 of them, if that makes sense.
I mean, so I think like the problem here is like the consumer preference. So I think you want to find like the market share of like this beer, and then like how much are they selling compared to like the competitors, which I think we
Absolutely.
discussed.
So now do you think we should even look at the distributors or no?
I don't think so, because that's not like the main problem, because the margins are all the same, and it's
That's
like
great.
broken
Who
down
disagrees
to-
with Alvin? Nobody? Everyone's just a sheep?
Is there a way to, I'm not sure if this was mentioned, but are all distributors getting the same number of, I guess, beer sort of sent to them?
They're not. Since there's the delivery backlog from 2 days to 2 weeks, they're not getting the product when they really want to, especially when the consumer preference is showing demand for some types of beer. They're not getting that when they really want to.
So maybe there's like an issue with inventory we can take a deeper look at.
Absolutely. But is that the distributor inventory, or is it the manufacturer inventory that's causing a problem?
I'd say it's the manufacturer's problem.
Absolutely. So back to Alvin's point, should we even look at the distributors for the purpose of this case?
Don't think so.
Spot on. Let's move on to the consumers. And that's a key takeaway for the distributors. Let's move on to the consumers. Cool. Now we're at the consumers, at the bars, apologies. And we know that the bars are also favoring some beers to the others. So this is not only happening at the distributor level, it's also happening at the bar level. And obviously the bars have limited warehouse capacity. Where would you like to what are the different questions you would like to ask some of these bar managers to figure out why our beer is not being sold?
Is there a change in consumer preference when it comes to beers in some type
Excellent
of way?
question. Very good question to keep in mind. What else?
Maybe the margin for the beers on the
Sorry?
bar level, like the margin for the beers on the.
So margins are the same for all the beer. Therefore, consumer preference is the only thing that's part of the equation. What else would you like to ask them?
Like it was mentioned, maybe like the sort of the growth rate of like the specific company and its products, but also maybe the performance of the respective like local bars, maybe. Not sure if that makes sense.
No, that does not make sense, unfortunately. Could you rephrase?
Like whether or not certain bars are like performing, like their performance is declining or not. So like there are certain products are going out at the same level they're coming in.
So we just discussed that. Who was that? Someone said consumer preference might be a problem. So does that sound like a bar problem or a consumer problem?
I think
You're not doing well because the beer is not there, or do you think the bar is not doing well because there's a mismatch between consumer preference and demand? Someone who
Matter.
answered.
Consumer preference and demand.
Okay, so back to John's point. John, where do you think the problem lies?
I would probably agree with the consumer then.
So what's the key takeaway?
Not too sure.
Would it be
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
For the consumer preference, is the Rascal beer like low in consumer preference because it's unpopular or because it's not supplied enough so people don't get to try it to like it? Like, is that
Very
the
good
issue?
Interesting fact. Roscoe beer is the #1 preferred beer by consumers in that country.
Oh, okay.
Still not doing well. So now the question is, what would you like to know about the consumers? What questions would you ask?
So since you said that Rascal beer is actually like #1 in that country, that's what they prefer. So do the bars only measure preference by their sales instead of consumer opinion?
Excellent question. What else? Very good question. I'm gonna start calling names. Hey, sorry, hold on, buddy. Catherine, Ian, Naveen, Amanda, Courtney, Ivy, Ruby, Onik, Ariel. I think that's it. Kaylee, Rohit. Come on, guys, let's talk. Let's have a conversation here. There's no right or wrong answer, and we're not like, this is not like your Deloitte consulting interview. Just have fun.
It sort of feels like a Deloitte consulting.
Okay, Deloitte consulting interview is gonna be very like technology based. This is very strategy based. So don't even worry about this. Think about it, right? Like, let's say you're the CEO of this beer company. What would you like to do? Except for consuming a lot of the beer yourself. What else would you like to do? What are the questions you'd like to ask?
May I ask a question, or are you waiting for the other people to speak?
Still waiting, but they're shy. Can't help it, right? Go for it.
Okay, I guess like if I was CEO of a beer company, I would be wondering like what my competitors are doing that are maybe outperforming my own popularity.
Absolutely.
So I'll try to look at the trend and maybe like what maybe rising companies in the beer industry are doing in order to rise, basically.
You're the #1 preferred beer in the country, and yet your beer is not being sold too well at the bar level. What do you think is happening?
If I may add on something, I feel, in my personal opinion, it's due to, even though they are considered the top brewery within the nation, it's more so the fact that the level of output towards the supplies in terms of the demand is not being processed to the level that they are looking for.
Right, we already figured that out. What else?
Yeah, so it's kind of more of an issue within the brewery / the distribution because they are unable to kind of withhold to those standards. If I get that.
Absolutely, we also figured that out. What else?
In terms of the client side or the bar side?
Think weird stuff. Sure, think out of the box.
Can we figure out like the consumer demographic? Like, when you say it's the most preferred brand, is that just
okay? Consumer preference, demographics, yada yada yada. That's great. Well, where are we going wrong? We already know consumers love Roscoe beer because they're idiots, but like they're not getting it, right? They're not getting a lot as opposed to like what they should be getting because again, as Jay pointed out, there's a supply demand mismatch. What's happening here at the bar level or maybe at the distributor level that we ignored earlier with this updated information?
Like maybe they're not going to the bars anymore to get their beer.
Great, and pretend this is pre-COVID.
Okay.
So, people still be partying, but
are we producing enough beers to be distributed?
We talked about that. Jay said supply and demand mismatch. What else? What else might be happening? What kind of question would you like to ask? What's running through your head?
Are our beers being shown?
Yes, exactly. Placement. What's the placement at the bar level? So earlier we said bars are probably not that important to look at. Maybe the bars are playing some dirty games to not show our beer in the first place. Placement, what else?
I would just add on to that as like a secondary to the placement question is how are the competitors, like are the competitors giving a better deal to the bars than we are, to the point of they're kind of pricing us out of the market and almost, I guess, signing, maybe unofficially, but it's almost becoming like an exclusive deal to where we're being completely pushed out of the market?
100%, like you hit the nail on the head. They're not pricing us out per se because the margins are the same. So you can't outprice someone where the margins are the same, but they are having exclusive deals that the bar previously did not reveal to the management of Roscoe Beer. Therefore, no product placement, therefore, no sales to the consumers. Spot on. So awesome. So I know we're running short on time. I really want to get to Q&A to sort of, help you understand the different steps of this process. So let's take a minute to summarize our thoughts, and whoever wants to volunteer to sort of summarize the case, let's do it. Any volunteers? Anyone who may not have spoken earlier? Okay, I'm just gonna.
I can try.
Go for it.
So to summarize it, we just like talk about all the conclusions that we need and all our analysis. Okay. So for this case, we were able to separate it into 4 different buckets. So we looked at the brewery, the distributor, the bars, and the consumers, and that we realized that the main problem actually lies with the brewery because there's a huge bottleneck in their distribution and their forecasting that doesn't line up. It takes up to 2 weeks to ship it out, so that really slows them down. And then that kind of trickles down to the distributors and bars, where since they're not receiving it, they're not putting it out. And even though we found out that the consumers actually prefer Roscoe Beer in this country, since it's not being shipped enough to these distributors, it can't be sold. So therefore it's not considered popular as by sales. And we also realized that a lot of other beer companies have exclusive deals with these bars, which makes them promote other beers instead of Roscoe beers. So the main thing that we need to fix is the brewery distribution first.
Absolutely. Very good summary. Thank you. And I know you were rushing through it to keep the 45 seconds mark. So sorry about that, but you can go a little slow next time. That's totally fine. As long as you get points in there, right? You don't have to state the full case. So hopefully this was fun. I don't know if this was awkward or something, but I'm just seeing your great faces and nobody's talking. So I'm just gonna go through like my thought process with this case and sort of how I would approach it. Maybe that's helpful. First and foremost, the way we bucketed it off, it was great. This is how I would approach it as well. Thank you, John. So, the clarification questions were great. So keep them coming. I think you guys hit the nail on the head, and some of you used the framework I gave you earlier. So it was great. You always want to restate the case. So someone should take, 15 seconds to restate the problem statement, just so you tell the interviewer that you've been actively listening and you're getting the problem statement down right. That's also a very important component, and that's always something you should just do as like best practice. Now, for the framework, the key takeaway I want all of you to have today is not every single bucket that you list in your framework is going to be relevant at the end of the case, right? So for this example, as Faith, summarized for us, the 2 things that we really have to look at. Number 1, the brewery and the distribution, to our distributors in the first place. And then number 2, the placement at the bars, right? Really, those are the 2 key factors that this case can boil down to. Now, if we had more time, if we had like 30 more minutes, I would give you like more statistics and numbers and around like all the product placement figures and consumer placement figures and all that good stuff. But since we only had limited time, what you really saw was out of the 4 buckets that you presented and we all brainstormed together, 2 of them were relevant and 2 of them you had to completely discard. And that is the nature of any case interview. And you have to get really comfortable with discarding your own ideas that you presented 5 minutes ago, because based on updated data, it's no longer relevant to the case, right? So be very mindful of that, and that's completely okay. It gets a lot of time to get used to, so it's totally okay if you're nervous, you're not, you're a little hesitant of like, I just told you about distributors, but they don't matter anymore. What you talking about? Like Alvin, that's why like I challenged Alvin's point when he said distributors, we shouldn't really look at them for this case. Like, does anybody have like a counterpoint? but it's totally normal to go through that in a case interview, and you have to get very comfortable with that. So that's number 2, sort of the key takeaway. Number 3, elevator speech at the end, the summary of the case, excellent, how you did it, Faith. You might want to switch up the order, the way you did it, right? So every time you summarize, think about if you're talking to the CEO, does the CEO want to hear the specifics first or the high level first, right? So the specifics or the summary of your recommendation, probably the summary followed by the specifics, right? So when you summarize the case, Faith, the way I would approach it is say, we looked at your problem and these are the 2 things that we think we should focus on. Number 1, product placement and renegotiating our contract with the bars. Number 2, distribution and making sure our demand supply forecasting matches up to what our distributors are asking. Now, the reason we said these 2 recommendations are because of X, Y, and Z, and then here are the next steps. So whenever you're ending a case, 2 things that will help you differentiate amongst your peers and really get you those extra juicy points at the end of it. Number 1, your key risks that you've identified through your recommendations, because let's be honest, no recommendation is perfect, right? Anybody, even at Deloitte, we have recommended a lot of stuff in 2019 that was no longer true after COVID hit. And we had to change up all those models in a matter of weeks. So every recommendation has its own sort of flaw, and you got to point out that flaw. For example, in this case, you could say the flaw is, okay, what if the bars are already locked into a contract with your competitors for a few years? Well, you really, you could try as hard as you want, but they can't break out of that contract and just sign with you right away, right? So that legal aspect will be a risk. Second, I mentioned at the beginning of the case, and nobody really touched into that, the infrastructure was a problem. I think one of you asked a question about that. If the infrastructure is a problem, that's kind of why we're having 2 weeks to 2 days. It's this huge spectrum of delivery times. Okay, how do you fix that? Well, have we tried alternative modes of transport as opposed to just vehicles, right? Or trucks? Have we tried shipping? Have we tried airplanes? Or is that too much of a risk because it's, let's say, a consumable product, right? So it's gonna maybe require temperature control or something like that, for example. So that's another way you can identify the key risks. And then your final thing you should say is next steps. So the reason why you say next steps is assuming, let's say, in a real client situation, your clients really like your ideas. What can they do from tomorrow to start implementing your ideas? That's sort of what you have to highlight. So number 1, for example, in our case, the brewery, right? And the supply demand forecasting, let's bring on board a couple of experts and a couple of, more folks who can help us plan this out better. Let's work closely with the 250 distributors that we already have our, contracts with, and figure out what the historical demand patterns look like and what can we, do next for this year. And in the case of bars, let's look at all the contracts we have or the distributor has with the bars. And let's see how many of them can we tap into, how many of them are coming due that we can, go and renegotiate ourselves, and how many do we have to assume that we can't touch them, right? For X number of years. That's next steps. So you don't have to dive in that much detail with that, but if you do have time at the end of the case, it's always good practice to do that. So with that, I know we have 5 minutes. Happy to go overboard. Happy to stay longer to answer any questions you may have. But hopefully this was helpful and this was exciting. And sorry if you don't consume alcohol. I'm not trying to make you an alcoholic by use of this case. It was just an operations case. So.
Yeah, first off, I want to say thank you for conducting this case study. It was a good experience. It's definitely challenging. But I had a question. Was there anything from the case that we should have disregarded quickly after you gave new information, or something we were on too long for?
Distributors, right? Because the minute I told you that it is a supply, a demand forecasting problem, right? And then they're not getting the product. I think at some point I mentioned they're not getting the product. That your bell should ring right away saying, oh, if you're not getting the product, the distributors are not making the product. It's the manufacturers, or which is our plants, our breweries, right? And that's when the alarm signs go and you say, okay, let's move on from this. But in a real life case scenario, let's say you're interviewing for Bain or BCG, before you take that step, you have to vocalize your thoughts and say, given this information, in my opinion, I don't think distributors are the core of this problem. I think the problem stems from somewhere else. I would like to focus on the bars or the consumers or the breweries, if that makes sense. That's how you'd vocalize in a real case scenario. Does that help? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And I think like something else also I noticed that like I remember like you mentioning like the product placement, but like I think I kind of like disregarded that too and like didn't like note it down. I feel like that's why like we also like didn't get to like that last point too. So
That's totally fine. That's why you have to pay extra careful attention to every piece of information that the interviewer throws at you. I made a habit of writing it down twice so I remember, because sometimes, I mean, this is a very short case, but sometimes you're gonna get a lot more information thrown at you. You have to like sort of pick it up as quickly as possible.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
If we were to
Hey,
do this
Raj,
again,
I just wanted. Go ahead, please.
sorry. If we were to do this again, is there anything else that you would recommend we do instead?
With respect to which aspect of the case again? Sorry, because there are a lot of different things that we covered today.
I'd say just like your general feedback about how well we did.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Nobody asked me about the competitors. So there was a piece of information where we had more information about the competitors. Nobody asked me about that. So I would definitely like, the original buckets that I gave you at the beginning of this presentation, you got to ask me about the competitors. For example, the answer to this, I mean, just the information that I had at hand was we have 6 to 8 competitors and we have a bigger market share than the other 6 to 8 competitors. So we also have the biggest market share. So that's also like when you hear that, that's also when you can have sort of a couple of alarm bells ring when you're saying we have the biggest market share, we only have a few competitors and we're still not doing well. It's a consumer problem or it's a bar problem. It's a product placement problem, for example. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Vivian, you have the same question. Cool. Who else? Patrick, question? Cool.
Awesome. Well, if anyone doesn't have any more questions, then you can feel free to hopefully reach out to Raj. If you're okay with it, Raj, we would love to put your LinkedIn in our newsletter and also in the chat so people can reach out to you for further help. But Jay, if you can drop that below. So quickly before we leave and do our closing announcements, we're going to take a group photo. So if everyone wants to turn on their cameras, that would be great. And again, thank you, Raj, for so much for leading us through this case study. I know a lot of us are beginners, so maybe we're scared to speak up, but we definitely learned a lot. And thank you to those who participated.
Absolutely. Happy to provide, more resources, but it's a fun thing. I guess a personal anecdote, I was so involved in case studying back in the day at UCI that I sat at Blaze with my best friend and we did market sizing on a Blaze tissue paper. So it was pretty interesting. We estimated the number of ranch packets that Blaze will hand out with any given pizza in a day. So anyway, we can dive into that later. But yeah, happy to take the picture and happy to help.
Cool. So I will take the picture in 3, 2, 1. And then I'll take one more. 3, 2, 1. Great. Thank you so much, guys.
Happy to stay on for longer for questions if anyone has any.
Alrighty. Yes, feel free to keep dropping questions down below in the chat, but I'm also going to be presenting our closing slide. So next week is actually going to be a little different. We're going to have UCI x UCR UBA social from 5 to 6 right before our event. So feel free to scan this QR code to start registering, and it'll also be linked in our newsletter. So no worries if you miss it right now. And moving on, we are going to give you options to stay connected with us. We loved having you guys here with us today and glad that you got to interact with Raj. If you want to register for our next event, it's going to be a business careers and entertainment panel, and it's going to be next Wednesday as well. And in the middle are all our social medias, websites, ways to reach out. And of course, on the right is our Discord. We meet for office hours every Monday from 9:15 to 10:15. Whether you have career questions or looking for ways to get more involved in UBA or just talk, we're here to hang out. So yeah. Thanks again for coming. Thank you again, Raj, for your time, and definitely connect with Raj as we send out his LinkedIn in the newsletter. Bye, everyone.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.